Hello. I'm trying to figure out how to start with a straight face because YouTube selects the picture. And again, I've told you I always end up looking like. Anyway, so we'll see. I'm going to get caught up this week. I did not do a full session on chapter 13. It is a chapter that veers away from what Mark was doing, which usually is more of a practical what was going on when. And this is 13 is a chapter of things that Jesus draws from the Old Testament concerning not only the coming of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which is in the middle of 14 to 24. The one that where it talks about don't go downstairs from your house or grab anything, but leave the city. And the reason he said that is when the Romans came to destroy finally Jerusalem after the revolt in the late 60s AD, the Jewish people ran to Jerusalem thinking they would be safer inside the city, which was walled. And Jesus told them not to do that, to run to the country, not even bother to go down. And the reason for this is that the Romans made a siege around Jerusalem, and it was one of the most horrific war battles or siege in all of history. It was many weeks long. Thousands and thousands of people died of starvation. They got desperate, looking through cow's dung for anything edible. There was even one story about a mother who ate her child. It's really horrible to read about. Josephus, who is the Jewish historian that wrote, you can Google him or just Google 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem, and you will get some pretty intense background. I was reading a commentary that was written by a man just many hundreds of years afterwards, not the 1,000 like most commentaries, and he gave pretty gruesome descriptions of what went on. And I just wanted to say culturally, he says not to come down from the roof, and people think that's odd, but in those days the houses were built, they were flat roofs. A lot of people hung out there because it was hot, and you could literally walk from roof to roof, so you could use it as a roadway and get out of the city. Also, the reason why the temple was so utterly destroyed, and Jesus talks about this, he said, one stone will not be left on top of another. And the reason this happened is there was a rumor among the Roman soldiers that the Jewish people had hid gold in between the stones. So when they went to tear it down, they completely tore it down and no stone over the other. Also, Jesus in this section talks about the end days. He talks about how the Jews were looking for that Messiah, and he emphasizes how bad it will be. So it's not just about 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem. It does talk about the end times. Grab yourself a good commentary and read them. I have to admit that being during the 70s and 80s, it seemed like every other teacher was teaching on the end days, and to be honest, I just got a little weary of it because, so many things were taken out of context or it's not real clear. Even John in Revelation, he's talking not so much about the very end times in parts, although he is in parts, but I don't study it well enough to let you know. So go have at it and enjoy chapter 13. And of course, Jesus emphasized that no one knew that but the Father, even he and the angels did not. So that's, I think we know that if we're with Jesus, he's going to take care of us no matter what. And the Father, of course, decides when, and we can be at peace being in his hand. So we'll move on to chapter 14, where Mark went back to the day-to-day happenings. The Jewish people believed that when you got near death that you could see the future, and that's why chapter 13 was put there, because of course Jesus is talking about the future. Mark probably put, or Peter, probably put the different times Jesus spoke about the end times, whether 70 AD or when Jesus comes again, at different times, and they put it all together in a section at this part because people nearing death could see the future. So it made sense to people that were listening to this originally. So in chapter 14, we're going to go back to where the disciples and Jesus are. They're in Bethany, staying at Lazarus' house where Mary and Martha are sisters. And it was before Passover. And the verses 1 to just verses 1 and 2, it talks about the chief priests and the scribes. These are men that should know the sacred scriptures, as it said in the Greek. They were hoping, and this is what it says in the Greek, that they would be able to seize him by craftiness, and then they might be able to kill him, destroy him. So they had a plan that they wanted to secretly take him and kill him so it wouldn't cause such an uproar. But obviously at this time at Passover, they could not dare try to do that because at Passover, there was, oh gosh, I'll have to get my numbers right. I'll find it as we go. There was the population of Jerusalem, but then it would swell to almost 1 million. They put different counts between 1 million and 3 million, because what would happen is any male within 15 miles of Jerusalem had to spend Passover in Jerusalem, and they had to spend the night of Passover in Jerusalem. So that greatly enlarged the population, but every Jew everywhere in the world had the ambition that they would spend at least one Passover in Jerusalem. So it was very important to them, a dream. So you have anywhere from 3 to 10 times the population crammed into Jerusalem with the walls. And remember, it did not spread out like Houston does with its suburbs or other cities that we are in, but was pretty much crammed into a set area with the walls. The Jewish authorities were anxious that the crowd would not get rowdy because, of course, Passover's the celebration of the Jews being released from bondage with the Egyptians. And here they are in bondage to the Romans. So it was always an uneasy time. Also, the authorities did not want the Jewish authorities, the scribes, the chief priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they did not want any trouble because that would involve them losing their position, because it was the Romans that supported them and gave them these cushy jobs. And so that was another reason they did not want to cause any problem or riot. Now, the Roman authorities, of course, were looking out for the same reason. Jerusalem was not a Roman guard headquarters, but they would send in scores, if not hundreds or thousands of Roman soldiers into the city to help to keep peace. So you can imagine what it looked like with so many thousands of people in the city going to the temple to sacrifice their lamb, and then finding a place to have a celebration. So that is verses 1 to 3. Verses 3 to 9 is talking about Jesus being anointed at Bethany. So every other night, except the night of Passover, Jesus went to Bethany. And all other times, he was surrounded by thousands of people that listened to him. So he knew that he was safe because they weren't going to grab him in front of so many witnesses. And then at night, he and his disciples would they were kind of sneaking out and hiding at Bethany because Jesus wanted to die on his own terms. So he did not want to be arrested or secretly killed before the time was right. So there is a sense of Jesus hiding in Bethany. And it says that he went to a banquet. Other gospels say it was at Lazarus' house. Mark says it was at Simon the leper. It may be that Lazarus asked Simon to host that party because obviously he had a big enough house and it was a house of great luxury because in this section it talks about them. They were reclining at the table, and only places that had big enough areas to have a dining situation where you reclined, that was a pretty ritzy house. And Simon the leper was also a Pharisee, so he was probably pretty wealthy. He obviously he'd been healed either by Jesus or just at the time the skin disease. It was never leprosy. They didn't have leprosy at that time, but there were lots of skin diseases. You get kind of the picture that he had been healed, possibly by Jesus, but he certainly was a friend of Jesus. And it made me think this week that we need to also realize that not every Pharisee hated Jesus. They didn't. In fact, in a way, they just distrusted Jesus. I don't think there was out and out hate for him personally. In fact, I'm sure many of the Pharisees appreciated all that he had to say. But in the way that their society was set up, they could not have this guy from some podunk village preaching and taking over their position. So it was more a social situation that they hated, not so much the man, Jesus, and the things he said. Not that they didn't, many of them did not hate him too. So Simon the leper was a Pharisee, and we have Nicodemus, we hear about later, who followed the Lord, and then Joseph at the end, who gave him his tomb. He also was a wealthy man, and so not every Pharisee was an enemy of Jesus. So they had a banquet, and there was a woman there. Now, the fact that a woman was there automatically told you that her reputation was not high, because women are not at these male meals. They just never are. And so if she was there, then it would have showed that she had a low reputation. The hosts would, of course, know of certain ladies of interest or entertainment that they would discreetly offer their other guests later that evening for entertainment, but you certainly didn't show up at the dinner. Also remember that many other people would sit around the wall in the dining room, what we'd call the dining room. And even though they weren't invited or part of the dinner, this was very typical because they could watch dinner. Now, why would they want to do that? I'm hoping you all are saying because they wanted to keep track of everybody's honor status and whether they lost honor or they gained honor. I cannot stress enough how important this honor status was and how it really decided how they lived their lives. We talked about, I think last time, it decided how you greeted a person in the street. It decided who you could marry. It decided who you could do business with. And that's why they didn't like Jesus, because he was presuming to have a higher honor status than he really did. And I want to take just a few minutes of time to really go over again, or a lot of new stuff about the importance of meals. Now, today we think about banquets sometimes, and society galas, or fundraisers, or government dinners, and you always watch to see who sat where, and you figured out, how important they are, because if you're sitting by the kitchen, you're not real important. Now, in this society, it was extremely important. Meals were the most important thing they had as a culture. Grab the wrong pages. So meals. It's very difficult to overestimate the importance of these honor status meals. And they had so much meaning. And before Jesus came and turned this world upside down, it was very exclusive. You would rarely invite or attend a meal that was not somebody equal in your honor status. The only time this was different was possibly if there was a stranger that was coming to your village, or they even would have their enemies at time come to a meal, because it allowed the host to check them out and to see where they came from, what they were up to, and if they were going to be a problem to the village. This is aside from just the family gathering at meals, which was a very group edifying event. So you had family dinners, then you had the more cultural social dinners, and you always had to reciprocate. You always had to invite the person who invited you to come to dinner at your house. So of course, you would never invite somebody that couldn't do that for you, nor would you want to attend if you couldn't. And again, the only difference of that is if it was a family meal. Also, if it was just a meal to have, like tonight, a banquet. And also the third kind was what I said about enemies and strangers. You wouldn't expect them to pay you back and have you to their house, of course. Now, if you will remember that parable Jesus told about the king, the rich leader who had a banquet, and no one, so this rich man, ruler, had a banquet, and none of his social equals came. And it's a great parable, but I won't go into it now about their flimsy excuses. And so he invited the poor and the needy and the injured and the widows of the town. And when that wasn't enough, he said, go to the byways and the hedges, because that's where the most lower class, despicable people would live. And so this man said, forget this. And he brought everybody in. Now they had to be dressed correctly. This probably had to do with sorry, that just went out of here. There's a lot going on at this house. So that was an exception, and people hearing that parable would be struck, flabbergasted by the fact that when his social equals refused him, which was quite an insult, that he invited people that were not only lower than his social class, but they could not invite him to their dinner. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute, how Jesus completely changed things in this society. So those are the different types of meals. They were very exclusive. They had very defined rules, where you sat, who you talked to. Even in the Romans would feed people different food depending on their social class. They didn't do that so much in Israel, but that's how snooty they would get. Now, people grew up in this society thinking that was perfectly normal, and it was respectable, and that's just the way the culture was. Of course, we've talked about seating at the table really said who was in the up and up. The closer you sat to the host, the more important you were. In fact, even in the Last Supper, as we talk more, John is on one side of Jesus and Peter's on the other. So even they did status seating like that. Now, if you did not play by the rules, you were considered very dishonorable and criticized. In fact, go to that story, I think it's in Luke, where he's invited and the host does not kiss him, greet him, does not wash his feet, does not sit him at the table. In fact, if you read that real close, you'll see that Jesus went to it and he sat himself at the table. I think it would be fascinating to know just where he sat himself, because he didn't bother with all those rules. And even Jesus said, watch yourself. You don't want to be sit at a table and then be asked to move down because you're not important enough. Instead, you want to sit in the lower status seats, and then you will be asked to move up. So meals were just huge. And again, to challenge any of those boundaries would prove you dishonorable. Now, there was a society, a community of very pious Jews at, I believe it said Qumran, near Jerusalem. It was a religious community. They were very pious. They outdid the Pharisees in everything they did because they believed the more holy and pious they were, it would hasten the time that the Messiah would come. And in that community, you couldn't even sit at dinner until you had been there a year. And then it was only after 2 years that you were able to drink their drink of congregation, which was a very important part of the ritual of dinner. And if you slandered any of your other members of this community, you would be not be allowed to eat dinner at the table with them for over a year. So you can see it's extremely important. Now, remember, this is because their greatest value is honor, and this was completely acceptable because this is what it was all about. Honor. That's what it was about. So meals just reinforced your honor status and who you were in society, but really it went beyond society. It was who you were in life and who you could barter with and do business. I can't stress this enough, just how important meals were. Now, the reason why is because Jesus, one of the most noticeable things about his public life is that he did not pay attention to these rules. In fact, remember the Pharisees were always accusing him of being a sinner because he ate with sinners and whores? That was just not done. So it, instead of being radically inclusive, Jesus's table was radically inclusive. Sorry. It excluded you in society, but Jesus was very inclusive. Also, it's leveled the status of everyone. It didn't support or put you in your place, but it brought everybody up to the same honor status. And that honor came from God, not from the village you were born in, not from what your father did. It was from God. And it also shared the honor in the fellowship. So when you stop and think about Jesus's meals that he had, it is a complete reversal and turning his culture upside down. So it was like a real life parable that Jesus lived that showed the inbreaking of God's kingdom into that society. Remember too, Jesus's rule for meals was very different. It was the first shall be last. You serve one another, and those who exalt themselves shall be humbled. So take some time sometime and just reread some of the meal situations in the Gospels and realize just how different it was and how Jesus changed everything by accepting everyone, anyone and everyone. So he's at Bethany. There's a woman there who had probably been a whore. She had been saved, or I should say cleansed by Jesus and healed, and without thought of herself and what she was doing to her own life, there's this sense that she spent everything she had on this vial of nard, which was imported from the Himalayas. And she probably had about 12 ounces of this pure concentrate. And usually they would take that concentrate and they would make scores of perfume bottles because it was very concentrated. Sorry. And there were some who said to themselves, but then publicly did it in front of Jesus as well as disciples, why are you allowing this woman to anoint your head with such expensive perfume? Don't you know it could have been sold for 300 denarii? And you know that was about 3 years worth of work. I mean, this perfume was probably thousands of dollars an ounce. If you compare it to our time. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Don't trouble her. What she has done is a beautiful thing. And the Greek word there for beautiful has the understanding that it was a moral and correct thing to do, but it had a sense of loveliness to it. So it wasn't just morally correct, but it was lovely. I think it's probably Scottish, the word bonny. Oh, she's a bonny lass, or that was the bonny thing to do. It's a real sense of doing what's right, but doing it lovingly. And Jesus said, for you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. Now, I want to read something I came across in a book. It wasn't Philip Keller, not Timothy Keller. This is Philip Keller in a book. And I want to read how he describes what happened when this woman anointed Jesus. The delicious fragrance ran down over his shining hair and thick beard. It enfolded his body with its delightful aroma. Even his tunic and flowing undergarment were drenched with its enduring pungency. Whenever he moved during the ensuing 48 hours, the perfume would go with him into the Passover, into the Garden of Gethsemane, into the high priest's home, into Herod's home, into Pilate's auditorium, into the crude hands of those who cast lots for his clothing at the cross. I had never thought about that, about how he would have walked around, because he wouldn't have changed clothes, of course, walked around during his last hours smelling so well anointed for burial. And so he says, as a result, what truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. So here Jesus has the confidence that the gospel will go all around the world, but says it'll be, her memory will be done in her honor. So we go on, then verses 10 to 11, then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray Jesus to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. So here the chief priests and authorities, even with the Herodians, had planned on maybe possibly kidnapping him and killing him privately. But here Judas gives them a great opportunity, and they're going to give them the equivalent of what they gave people for bounties. You know, the 30 pieces of silver was the equivalent of what people would get for turning in other people. Why did Judas do this here? And why did Judas do it at all? Maybe he had heard Jesus talk about death just one time too many, because this was not Judas's idea of what the Messiah would be. He was a radical nationalist. He believed the Messiah would come in power, and he wanted to see this done. He wanted to make Jesus comply with his plans. He didn't want to submit to Jesus. He wanted Jesus to submit to him. So he's thinking, if I can just get him arrested, he'll be pushed to do whatever marvelous thing he's going to do to defeat the Romans. So that's one way of looking at Judas. Now, so verses 12 to 16. And by the way, we're only going to go to verse 21 today, because this chapter is so full of incredible situations that happened that I didn't want to put it all in one. So we're Jesus on the first day of unleavened bread. Now, Passover was treated, the actual day was treated like a Sabbath. You couldn't work, you couldn't move, travel. The 7 days of the unleavened bread was a secondary celebration, and you had rules to adhere to, but it wasn't quite as strict as Passover. And you only have to Google those two things to have a better idea of it. But remember, Passover is the religious celebration of being released from the bondage of Egypt. So every year they celebrate it on the 14th day of their first month. It's also an agricultural celebration because the barley is ready to be harvested, and they would wave sheaves of barley before the Lord during this time of unleavened bread. And of course, you know, the unleavened bread was because they had to get ready to travel. They didn't have time to bake bread. God said to eat unleavened. That's without yeast. It's without it rising. And an interesting thing is that yeast actually absorbs particles from the air as it helps the bread to rise. And what an incredible picture that gives us of God sending them out from Egypt, not wanting them to take anything of Egypt with them, because he wanted them to be set apart people. So that's the unleavened bread. Verse 13 says, and he sent another gospel says Peter and John into the city to prepare. And he said, go to the city, and a man carrying a jug of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is my guest room? And he will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. Go prepare for us. And the disciples went to the city and found it just as he told them, and they prepared the Passover. Now, once again, here's Jesus organizing something, having it already, without him personally doing it, sort of like the colt at the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Here he goes. Okay, now remember, the city is packed with thousands of people. How are they going to find one man? Well, Jesus says he'll be carrying a jug of water. Now, to you and me, we're going, well, so what's it? Well, nobody in this culture except a woman would do such a thing. Women carried the jars of water. It was women's work. Men never did this. So for whatever reason, this man who very anti-cultural or all-cultural had to go to the well and get water, which would have been something to see because only women were around the well, and I wonder how he got the water anyway. But so it was very obvious there was only one man carrying a jug of water. So they pressed in through the crowd, you can just sort of picture them, and spoke to him, and he said, well, come with me. And he takes them to the house, and the owner of the house tells them that the upper room is ready. Now, in Jerusalem, the houses were built like a small box on top of a bigger box. They were square. And the upper room would be used for either a guest room or for storage, or the rabbis would even use the rooms to sit and teach their disciples. But there were stairs outside of the house that the people that used the guest room or the upper room could come and go without disturbing the family in the house. So this is the upper room that Jesus has arranged for, and Peter and John go and they prepare it. Now, I want to tell you what they needed to prepare for, because this is the Passover. Certain things were necessary, and these were the things they had to do to get ready. There was the lamb, to remind them of how their houses had been protected by the badge of blood when the angel of death passed through Egypt. They would have already sacrificed the lamb that day at the temple. Up to at least 10 people, that was the minimum, could share a lamb because it was costly. But they would also then, it could not touch the sides of a pan. So they would roast it on a spit over open flame. So they'd have to do that. There was the unleavened bread to remind them of the bread they had eaten in haste when they escaped from slavery. 3 days before Passover, there was a ceremonial sweeping out of the house of any leftover yeast so it wouldn't make the house or people unclean. There was the bowl of salt water to remind them of the tears they had shed in Egypt and of the waters of the Red Sea through which God had led them. This is in Deuteronomy. Oh dear, busted. Exodus, sorry, not Deuteronomy. Of course it was Exodus. Exodus 12. There was a collection of bitter herbs, horseradish, chicory, endive, lettuce, horehound, to remind them of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. There was a paste, can't pronounce it, a mixture of apples, dates, pomegranates, and nuts to remind them of the clay of which they had made bricks in Egypt. Through it, there were sticks of cinnamon to remind them of the straw with which the bricks had been made. And then there were the 4 cups of wine. The cups contained a little more than half a pint of wine, but 3 parts of wine were mixed with 2 of water. The 4 cups, which were drunk at different stages of the meal, were to remind them of the 4 promises in Deuteronomy 6, which tells you I have the wrong, no, never mind. I'm okay. I'll tell you what Deuteronomy 6 says. This is God speaking, I will bring you out from underneath the burdens of the Egyptians. No, that's Exodus 6. I'm so sorry. This is why I have to have it written down. Excuse me. Exodus 6, 6 and 7. I will rid you of their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched hand, and I will take you to me for a people, and I will be your God. So those were the 4 promises. Also, I'll just say, to encourage any of you who like to study or want to know something, anybody can do it. You can just study, even if you have problems with pronouncing words or you get a little spacey. So be encouraged. Okay, so they were there. Other things were going on, and the other chapters, like John chapter 13, tells you that Jesus had a whole discussion with them at the table, and they asked who was going to be the traitor, and he said, that whom I dip my bread into, and Judas did it. One thing I realized this time in doing Mark is the other disciples really didn't know who was going to betray them. And Judas was able to leave. Can you imagine if they had known it was Judas? Do you think they would have let him leave and betray Jesus? I don't know. It's really something to think about. So Judas, verses 17 to 21, and then we'll end after this passage. And when it was evening, he came with the 12, and they were reclining at table. This tells you it was a big room to be able to recline at table. And eating, Jesus said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me, which again is intimacy and closeness. They began to be sorrowful and to say to him one after another, is it I? He said to them, it's one of the 12 who is dipping bread into the dish with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. So one thing that we can take away from this section that's important is how deeply the woman who anointed his head worshiped him out of the intent of her heart. She was not inhibited by anything and loved and worshiped him, and that God saw her heart. Again, here with the Judas betraying him, Jesus loved Judas. Jesus tried to warn Judas not to do the thing he was to do. So here he's willing to take someone who's about to be disobedient. He wants to love him into obedience, and then he wants to warn him. And the Lord does the same for us. But like Judas, we have a free will. Otherwise, we would not be made in the image of God, who also has a free will. And he gave that to us to do. And so Judas used that, and Jesus allowed him to. And we can take that to heart and really listen to the Lord, not only in his love for us, but if he does, warn us. So, in the coming sections, we're going to be talking about Jesus and how he was arrested. And I want to just tell you that this was a ritual that the government had gotten down to a perfection, the Roman government as well as Israel, because of course honor was the big deal. So if you were arrested, they went out of their way to dishonor you publicly. So as you read ahead and you read of his arrest and the way that they treated him, be looking for areas of the dishonor that they do toward Jesus. And this they would do toward everyone who was crucified, but especially someone who seemingly had power over the people. So I look forward to the next time. Prayerfully read it, and we'll see you then. Thanks.